When I was a kid, I used to go to church every Sunday. By now, I haven't been in years, and to be honest, I wouldn't even really describe myself as religious anymore. I kind of completely lost touch with the church and Christianity. But recently, I've started paying a bit more attention to Christianity again. Not for religious reasons. This is not a video about religion. I'm an economics YouTuber, and definitely not a theologian. This is a video about power, money, and influence. Because recently, I've started hearing more about Christianity in a context that was entirely new to me. I heard that there are Christian pastors who own private jets.
You know, I've owned 3 different jets in my life, and used them and just burning them up for the Lord Jesus Christ.
Televangelist Jesse Duplantis says God himself told him it's time for an upgrade.
He said, I want you to believe me for a Falcon 7X. So I said, okay.
They tell their followers that God wants them to be rich.
The Bible says, if you do things God's way, you will be rich, period. Yes. So why aren't more Christians rich? Because only 4% of them believe this stuff.
If you're sick, broke, or desperate, the solution isn't healthcare or social support. It's donating more money to their church.
And remember, as you sow your seed, when you let go of what's in your hand, yes, God will let go of what is in his hand. So do it now. The number is on the screen. Pick up the phone and dial that number.
I'm going to ask you to sow an exceptional and uncommon seed of $1,000 into the work of God.
Jesus is your source. Whatever you do right now, don't you stop tithing. Don't you stop sowing offerings. Well, they won't let us go to church. Well, email it in there, text give or something, but you get your tithe in that church, you get that offering in that church, and then you go home and you do what we're supposed to do.
This is called the prosperity gospel. I also started hearing about Christian nationalism and stuff like mega churches. I heard how Donald Trump, a man who is said to have done some pretty unchristian things, is receiving overwhelmingly strong support from Christians all over the US. And here in Britain, I keep hearing about the rise of Christian nationalist movements tied to anti-immigration protests and far-right figures like Tommy Robinson. And in my mind, all of that just kind of doesn't add up, because back when I went to church, I remember it being all about helping the less fortunate and stuff like that. I remember the Bible being filled with passages like these. I tell you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Matthew 19:24. How I remember it, the central figure of Christianity, Jesus Christ, was all about helping the sick and poor. There's loads of passages in the Bible like this one where Jesus tells a wealthy young man that if he wishes to be perfect, then he should just go and sell all of his possessions and give the money to the poor. Or there's this one where Jesus physically storms the temple, overturns tables, and accuses merchants of corruption. It's one of the very few times Jesus uses violence, and it's against economic exploitation. And yet I see Donald Trump, the very president supported by these Christians, slashing healthcare and helping rich people to become even richer. And I'm seeing a mindset shift, where poverty and hardship is being seen as your own fault, and wealth is seen as a virtue. So I started researching how all of this came together, and found that Christianity was quietly reprogrammed to make inequality feel normal, and how this community-orientated religion that promoted humility, solidarity, and care for the vulnerable was reshaped into a moral framework that aligns far more comfortably with greed and individualism. This video isn't about bashing Donald Trump, nor is it about wealth inequality. This video is about how Christianity got corrupted by big money. Because as I read more and more about this new kind of Christianity, I realised this mindset shift is no coincidence. It's actually a carefully orchestrated lobbying effort that started several decades ago. All of this began at a rare moment when capitalism itself was under serious threat in the US. And in order to understand it, we need to travel back a couple of decades, more specifically to the 1930s. By the 1930s, capitalism had a serious problem. In 1929, the stock market had crashed, and this triggered the biggest economic crisis in modern history, the Great Depression. People lost their jobs, their homes, and the ability to feed their families. And unsurprisingly, people were frustrated with the state of the economy. Poverty was everywhere, and people started losing faith in capitalism as a system. In response, Americans elected Franklin D. Roosevelt, and under Roosevelt, the US entered a new economic era. An era characterized by a series of progressive economic policies. Roosevelt's New Deal. The New Deal's main policies focused on 3 R's: relief for the needy, economic recovery, and financial reform. Among other things, this encompassed jobs that were created through large public work programs. Banks and financial markets were regulated through laws like the Emergency Banking Act, the Securities Act, and the Glass-Steagall Act. A new baseline for social welfare was established with the Social Security Act. Labour rights were established through the Wagner Act, and the Fair Labour Standards Act set a national minimum wage and maximum work week and banned oppressive child labour. Taken together, the New Deal massively expanded the role of the state in the economy and created a lasting social safety net for Americans. And for working class people, the New Deal was freaking awesome. Living standards improved, job security increased, and the idea that markets needed rules became mainstream. But it wasn't just economic policies that were changing. The moral language that was surrounding everything changed too. At the same time, unions were growing stronger. Workers were organising collectively. Communities were mobilising around ideas of shared responsibility and mutual care. In short, this economic shift was being reinforced by a growing sense of collective moral power. And crucially, large parts of the church were reinforcing that message. Christianity, at least in many mainstream Protestant denominations, was increasingly being used to argue that poverty wasn't a personal failure but a social problem. This movement became to be known as the social gospel. It reframed Christianity away from individual salvation alone and toward collective responsibility. Eric and Conway and Naomi Oreskes write in their book, The Big Myth. The Christian argument for social welfare and economic equity was obvious. Jesus preached charity and urged his followers to love their neighbours as themselves, especially the poor. The church supported ending child labour, it was fighting for labour rights and advocating to build social safety nets. And the suffering of the Great Depression had led many churches to adopt resolutions, pronouncing capitalism's failures and calling for action. And for working class people, this alignment between economic reform, unions and religious morality was pretty powerful because it improved their living standards. But what was good news for working class people was deeply unsettling for large corporations and wealthy industrialists. Because for them, it had been pretty awesome that there had been no labour rights, child labour had been legal, and that there hadn't been a minimum wage. So this shift in policy and mindset was certainly anxiety-inducing for them. And in 1934, in the middle of the rollout of all these New Deal policies, something happened that pushed the anxiety industrial elites were feeling into outright panic. The General Council of the Congregational and Christian Churches held a significant meeting in Oberlin, Ohio, in June 1934. This meeting was basically a national assembly of representatives from local churches to discuss topics like The Rising Tide of Nationalism, a study of the origin and operation of a psychopathic form of patriotism. What are the teachings of Jesus about wealth? At this meeting that was taking place in the middle of this tumultuous economic era, the representatives from all these churches around America discussed the concentration of population and wealth, the social lag of individualism, technical defect in capitalism. They looked at communism and the Russian experiment, and the whole meeting revolved around the idea of abolishing capitalism and steering towards a planned economy. This meeting was pivotal in the history of American Protestantism. They created the Council for Social Action and passed a resolution stating that the Congregational and Christian churches would work for the abolition of the profit system. This became known as the Oberlin Anti-Profit Resolution. Yeah, so as awesome as that sounds for working class people, that wasn't cool with business elites. They liked profits. And this wasn't some fringe pamphlet by some random church. This was a formal statement passed by many established churches, openly declaring that capitalism might be morally wrong. So business leaders were faced with a choice. They could accept the moral consensus and fundamentally change capitalism, or they could reshape morality so capitalism no longer needed to change. As we'll see in this video, they chose the second option. But before we look at how they did that, let's look at who these business elites and industrial leaders actually were. We're talking about the owners and executives of large industrial corporations here. Not all of them, of course, but it was people whose wealth and power were directly threatened by unions, labour laws, and any suggestion that profit itself might be morally illegitimate. And these people organised in groups. It was groups like the National Association of Manufacturers, the United States Chamber of Commerce, the American Liberty League, which was founded in 1934, specifically to oppose Roosevelt's reforms. These groups represented companies in steel, oil, automobiles, rubber and manufacturing. Companies like Firestone Tires, General Motors, Standard Oil, the chemical company DuPont. These were firms that had benefited enormously from decades of weak labour protections, child labour, long working hours and minimal regulation. And they were watching all of that come under threat at once, which is why these organisations were spending millions lobbying against unions, minimum wages and labour protections. The extent is shocking, and I go a lot deeper into it in this video. In that video, I also mention one figure in particular that would become especially influential in the whole Christianity brainwashing. J. Howard Pugh, the head of Sun Oil. Pugh was fiercely opposed to the New Deal unions and welfare programs, and he believed that government intervention in the economy was not just inefficient, but immoral. So make sure you remember this guy. In the mid-1930s, American business leaders had already learned how effective ideology could be. They had funded newspapers, think tanks, and they had funded academics like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, and later on Milton Friedman. Academics who would propagate the myth that unregulated capitalism was the only viable economic system. Anyway, back to the year 1934, where business elites were faced with churches openly questioning the profit system itself. And after already having spent a great amount of money and effort on lobbying academia, newspapers and governments, their next step was to change how Americans thought about Christianity. Conveniently for them, they didn't have to invent this project from scratch. They already had a willing messenger. That messenger was Minister James W. Fairfield Jr., nicknamed the Apostle to Millionaires by a friendly writer. Fairfield took over the elite First Congregational Church in Los Angeles in 1935. He was already ideologically primed and outright rejected the social gospel movement. He believed that free market capitalism wasn't just economically efficient, but morally right. In Fiffield's worldview, Christianity wasn't about restructuring society or correcting economic injustice. It was about personal responsibility, personal morality, and personal freedom. He later coined the term Christian individualism and insisted that individual dignity was a Christian concept. And because this individual dignity flowed directly from God, any attempt by the state to step in and provide for people was morally wrong. Welfare programs like Social Security, in his view, didn't just help the poor. The state was taking over a role that should belong to God, or at least to the church. By making people dependent on the state rather than on their faith and their church, Fiffield argued that government welfare undermined both freedom and religion itself. The 1934 Oberlin Anti-Profit Resolution had also radicalised him, because all the abolishing the profit system talk in it looked like communism to Fiffield, and communism, in his view, was fundamentally hostile to religion itself, which theoretically isn't wrong. Karl Marx, the father of communism, had explicitly described religion as a tool of the ruling class to keep working people in check. And to Fiffield, that meant one thing. If churches aligned themselves with anti-capitalist politics, they were helping build a system that would eventually erase themselves. So when Protestant churches started to advocate for the poor by openly questioning the profit system, Fiffield saw an existential threat for Christianity itself. So Fiffield began meeting with other like-minded religious figures to discuss what to do next. And they agreed on one thing. The real danger wasn't just government regulation. It was what they called pagan statism, a worldview where the state replaced God as the source of moral authority. And to fight this, they founded an organization in 1935 and called it spiritual mobilization. Spiritual mobilization wasn't meant to be a mass movement. It wasn't trying to win over voters directly. Its real target was people working in the church, like pastors, ministers, and so on. Fiffield understood something crucial. At the time, going to church every Sunday wasn't optional. It was a central part of American life. And for many communities, the pastor was one of the most trusted authorities, if not the most trusted figure there was. If you could shape what ministers preached on Sunday, you could shape how millions of Americans thought about economics without ever mentioning economics. Fiffield produced sermons, pamphlets, study guides, and newsletters that reinterpreted Christianity through the lens of Christian individualism. Much of what he had to say was similar, if not identical, to arguments already made by the American Liberty League, Ludwig von Mises, and the National Association of Manufacturers. Like Mises, Fiffield asserted that Americans faced a choice between democracy and capitalism on the one hand, and dictatorship on the other. Paralleling the business opponents of the New Deal, Fiffield decried the growth of federal power. Every concentration of power in our national government, especially in its executive branch, represents a reduction of freedom for the individual citizen and for the constituent states. Fiffield demanded the clergy lead a revival of individual thought on a widespread scale to prevent American descent into the abyss of totalitarianism. But at this point, Fiffield was still just one libertarian-leaning individualist. It was business elites who turned him into a political weapon by supplying the money that allowed his ideas to spread nationally. This happened gradually. In 1940, the National Association of Manufacturers invited him to speak at its annual Congress of American Industry at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. The attendees also heard from J. Howard Pugh, president of Sun Oil, who spoke on preserving the private enterprise system. For the business elites in the room, this was probably when the potential became obvious. When the defense of capitalism came from a priest rather than a corporate executive, it didn't sound like self-interest. Capitalism could be defended as a matter of faith, and once that became clear, the funding followed. The most important figure here was J. Howard Pugh. Pugh didn't just sympathise with Fiffield's ideas, he recognised their strategic value. and he had previously been involved in anti-New Deal organizations like the American Liberty League. With Pew and other corporate sponsors' help, spiritual mobilization suddenly had the resources to scale. By 1942, spiritual mobilization had turned into a formal organization. Fairfield hired a financial controller and a board of advisors. The organization grew rapidly. In February 1947, Fairfield reported that in 3 years he had expanded the mass of their minister representatives from an initial 400 members to more than 10,000. They launched a magazine called Faith and Freedom, which was sent directly to clergy, church leaders, and religious institutions. The magazine didn't read like corporate propaganda, but pushed strong-worded arguments about unions being corrupt, dangerous, and stories about their violence. The magazine featured the work of prominent libertarian authors, including Ludwig von Mises, leader of the Austrian School of Economics, Leonard Read, founder of the Foundation for Economic Education, which is another libertarian think tank, and Henry Hazlitt, a founding member of the Future American Enterprise Institute, yet another libertarian think tank. There's honestly so many of them. Anyways, the magazine, even though filled with anti-collectivism rhetoric and libertarian economists, was framed as a magazine created by ministers for ministers. These were supposed to then package these messages of economic freedom into their Sunday sermons. Pew also fitted the bill for Fairfield to promote the libertarian economist Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, which is a book essentially arguing that any meaningful government intervention in the economy, like social welfare or regulation of businesses, inevitably leads to tyranny. Fairfield then mailed copies of the book directly to influential ministers across the country. There were many more promotional activities, and going through all of them would completely derail this video, so I'm just going to share one particular surreal example. In October 1947, Spiritual Mobilization organized a national sermon competition on the theme, The Perils to Freedom, offering $5,000 in prize money. In today's money, that's around $73,000. The participating ministers were unsurprisingly then expected to deliver those sermons to their congregation during Sunday services. And this wasn't even a one-off. Cash prize sermon competitions became a recurring tool in spiritual mobilization strategy. In an upbeat letter to Alfred Sloan, who was the head of General Motors and one of Fairfield's strongest supporters, the minister wrote, "We are having quite a deluge of letters from across the country indicating the feeling that spiritual mobilization has had some part in the awakening which was evidenced by the elections. Of course, we are a little proud and very happy for whatever good we've been able to do in waking people up to the peril of collectivism and the importance of freedom under God." Satisfied that the strategy was working, Fairfield's financial backers moved to scale it. The annual budget was doubled, with J. Howard Pugh once again setting the pace, directly soliciting contributions from executives at 158 big corporations, including General Motors, Chrysler, National Steel, Firestone Tire and Rubber, and Gulf Oil. With this new funding, Spiritual Mobilization had new resources to spread their message. In 1949, it launched the Freedom Story, a 15-minute radio program consisting of a little story, usually about a hard-working individual threatened by bureaucracy or collectivism, and a brief commentary from Fairfield. Fairfield's financial backers helped secure free airtime for these programs across the nation. In 1950, the radio show The Freedom Story was broadcast on over 500 stations. By late 1951, it aired on more than 800. I listened to a few of these very repetitive episodes, and they're linked in the sources document down below in the video description if anyone wants to put themselves through the same torture as I did. Also, the sources document lists all my sources, as in every video. Just mentioning that again. Later in this video, when we talk about the prosperity gospel, I'll talk about pastors buying mansions, fancy cars, and private jets with charity money. I don't own a private jet, which honestly is quite disappointing. So it would mean a lot if you supported me on Patreon. Okay, I admit the ugly truth, I'm nowhere near private jet wealth levels yet, and Patreon support helps me pay for my rent and food. Apparently, I just haven't been faithful enough because God, the YouTube algorithm, or whatever higher power controls my life, just hasn't rewarded me with eternal wealth yet. And in reality, making videos like this takes a lot of time and research, and I have to buy a lot of stuff like books, software, cameras, lenses, and Patreon is what actually lets me do that and lets me spend weeks working on deep research projects like this one. So if you want to support the channel and the research behind it, you can do that on Patreon. I also organise a book club on there where we read the books that I use for my videos and meet up online every 2 weeks to discuss them. So if you've been wanting to read a bit more and be part of a community that discusses economics and all other kinds of stuff, this book club will keep you accountable. And also, everyone in the club is super nice and cool. Anyway, back to this very, very boring radio show. Week after week, listeners had the same associations reinforced. That free enterprise and Christianity were inseparable, that regulating businesses was a step toward tyranny, and that defending capitalism was a religious duty. By the early 1950s, this message wasn't controversial anymore. It was familiar and sounded like common sense. But Fifield also liked to refer to the Bible itself. Obviously, just the passages that would fit into his whole freedom narrative. Fifield and his allies increasingly turned to the Ten Commandments to give their economic arguments divine authority, especially the one that you're not supposed to steal. Taxes, they argued, violated this commandment. Redistribution of wealth was theft. And welfare programs weren't moral acts but coercive ones. Property rights were reframed as God-given rather than legally constructed. But Fifield wasn't working alone. In fact, his message was only ever going to reach so far. His messaging about Christian individualism, anti-union theology, and libertarian economics worked well for pastors and business elites, but it wasn't exactly designed for mass appeal. That's where Norman Vincent Peale comes in. Norman Vincent Peale served on the advisory board of Spiritual Mobilization alongside figures closely tied to business groups like the United States Chamber of Commerce, which is how he got embedded in the wider pro-business Christian movement. Norman Vincent Peale was the minister at Marble Collegiate Church in New York, and unlike Fifield, he didn't speak primarily to pastors, but directly to Americans. Fifield was basically the architect of hardline Christian libertarianism, and Peale was sort of the PR department. Peale preached a much softer, more approachable version of the same worldview, one he called practical Christianity. Peale's approach to faith was not too focused on how Jesus helped the poor. His approach to Christianity centered around mindset, attitude, and personal success. Peale talked about confidence, optimism, positive thinking, and while Fifield's and Peale's topics sounded completely different on the surface, the underlying message was strikingly similar. In 1945, Peale launched Guideposts, a magazine that blended American nationalism, free enterprise, and Christianity into a single feel-good worldview. Guideposts didn't attack unions head-on. It didn't rage against regulation, but instead it told stories. Stories about individuals overcoming hardship through faith. Stories where prosperity and wealth signaled virtue. These stories framed success as a moral achievement, while painting economic failure as an individual rather than structural problem. And all of it was nestled in between feel-good articles about positivity, self-belief, and personal success, making the ideology easy to absorb without ever feeling like politics. And the magazine didn't survive on subscriptions alone. It was kept afloat through direct financial backing from major industrial figures, including our favourite bro, J. Howard Pugh of Sun Oil, executives from Eastern Airlines, Standard Oil, and many more. Some large corporations like General Motors and R.J. Reynolds Tobacco even ordered guidepost subscriptions in bulk and distributing them directly to employees. In other words, the moral voice of Christianity had been used to shape workplace attitudes, discourage collective action, and reframe economic insecurity as a personal challenge rather than a structural one. In 1947, Peel delivered what would become one of his most influential sermons. He called his sermon the Tripod of Freedom. Peel had been directly inspired by the National Association of Manufacturers. They had invented the Tripod of Freedom in 1940, so 7 years earlier, and had already built an insanely big and expensive marketing campaign around it. Among many other efforts, they had displayed 45,000 billboards all over the US, which were seen by an estimated 65 million Americans daily. According to the Tripod of Freedom, American society rested on 3 inseparable pillars: representative government, religious liberty, and free private enterprise. Peel was now reusing the Tripod of Freedom for his sermon, directly aligning Christian morality with this messaging. The theory of the Tripod of Freedom was that if any of these pillars was weakened, the entire structure would collapse. According to the National Association of Manufacturers and Peel, regulation threatened freedom, and through that, eventually, faith and religion itself. This framing was incredibly effective because it turned economic policy into an existential struggle. It framed what was actually a class struggle, the rich versus the poor, as something entirely different: the choice between freedom and authoritarian tyranny. By 1952, it was estimated that American businesses were spending more than $1 billion every year on free enterprise messaging. This obviously also went really well with all the Red Scare propaganda and McCarthyism of the 1950s, but that's a topic for another video. Let's get back to Peel. Peel's influence peaked in 1952 with the publication of The Power of Positive Thinking, which sold more than 5 million copies. This bestseller successfully fused traditional Christian faith with modern capitalist values and an obsession with personal achievement and self-improvement. The book transformed Christianity into a kind of motivational system, and faith became a pathway to material success. The book taught that religion brings material reward and leaned heavily into pop psychology, encouraging followers to never think of yourself as failing. Peel, who was often called God's salesman, transformed religious practice into a tool for personal and material achievement. Structural inequality wasn't talked about at all anymore, and the book leaned on spiritual problem solving, claiming that every problem can be solved if you pray. If you failed, it was because you just didn't believe hard enough. But let's get into how successful this book actually was. It sold 5 million copies. Most non-fiction books are considered successful if they sell 10 to 50,000 copies. A bestseller might sell 100 to 500,000. Selling 5 million copies of a book, especially in the 1950s, didn't just make this a huge success. It was dominating culture. This wasn't just some fringe religious text read only by devoted churchgoers. This was one of the most influential self-help books of the entire 20th century. The Power of Positive Thinking was a mass market breakthrough that replaced the church's traditional concern for the poor with a religious celebration of wealth and individual success. And it resonated deeply with a rising class of business elites. And this is where it gets juicy. One of the families most immersed in Peel's worldview was, surprise, the Trump family. Fred and Mary Trump, Donald's parents, were long-standing members of Peel's congregation at the Marble Collegiate Church in New York. Donald Trump grew up inside this moral universe, one where confidence mattered more than humility, and where success and domination signaled righteousness. So it's no surprise Peel even officiated Donald and Ivana Trump's wedding in 1977. Trump would later describe the power of positive thinking as one of the most important influences on his life. By then, the work was already done. Before we continue, I want to talk about something else really quick, because this video is about power, influence, and who gets to shape systems behind the scenes. And one of the most underrated ways power operates today is through your personal data. Every time you sign up for something or make a purchase, you usually enter your data on a web form and give it to some company. And that data is really valuable. It can be used for targeted advertising, political messaging, or even identity theft. And oftentimes your data doesn't just stay with the company you signed up to. What you don't see is that behind the scenes, your data gets copied. And those copies get forwarded, sold, and merged with other envelopes full of your information. Information that you may be entered in when making a different purchase. This is done by data brokers. Data brokers are companies whose business model is collecting and reselling personal information. The crazy part is this usually isn't illegal. It's buried in terms, public records, and data sharing agreements. The result is that your personal data ends up in places you never knowingly sent it to. And while you can contact these companies yourself to ask for removal, there are hundreds of them, and your information often just reappears. That's why I've been using Incogni. Incogni automatically contacts data brokers on your behalf and repeatedly requests the removal of your personal information over time. And if you come across a site exposing your data that isn't covered automatically, which honestly has never happened to me, well, in that case, Incogni's custom removals feature lets you send them the link and their privacy team handles it for you. You can also see which brokers had your data and track removal requests directly in your dashboard. Incogni is also the first and only personal data removal service that has been independently verified, which matters in an industry like this. So if you're like me and want to reduce how traceable you are online, you can use the link in the description or go to incogni.com/AnnaBocker for 60% off the annual plan. And in the very unlikely event you don't like it, there's even a 30-day money-back guarantee, which makes it risk-free to try Incogni. Anyway, thanks for Incogni for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back into it. Trump wasn't the only fan of Peele. Trump, as well as Nixon, loads of presidents, and a lot of business elites at the time were very big fans.
Dr. Norman Vincent Peale. With a deep understanding of human behavior and an appreciation for God's role in our lives, Dr. Norman Vincent Peale helped originate a philosophy of happiness. Through the American Foundation of Religion and Psychiatry and his many books, Dr. Peale became an advocate of the joy of life, helping millions find new meaning in their lives. Few Americans have contributed so much to the personal happiness of their fellow citizens as Dr. Norman Vincent Peale.
And in some cases, they were also the financial backers of one man who would scale this view of Christianity through television and radio shows to a scale that Christianity had never seen before. And that man was
Billy Graham.
Billy Graham was arguably the most influential Christian figure in the United States during the 20th century, and by far the most influential evangelical preacher in American history. Graham became famous through what he called crusades. These were large-scale revival events held in stadiums and arenas where he preached a simple, emotionally charged message about sin, redemption, and personal responsibility. His breakthrough moment came in 1949 with the Los Angeles Crusade, a weeks-long revival during which he preached to 350,000 people that turned him into a national sensation. Graham filled stadiums. His sermons were broadcast on radio and television. and he reached millions of Americans who would never read a libertarian pamphlet or who were just not interested in politics. Graham and our oil CEO Pew met and started corresponding in 1954. Pew and Graham shared the belief that liberal progressive theology led directly to socialist politics. In their view, theology and economics were inseparable. If churches taught collective responsibility and social justice, people would eventually support unions, welfare, and state intervention. But spreading conservative theology would spread conservative social and economic policy. Inequality of wealth was not a social failure. It was God's plan. Attempts to redistribute wealth weren't compassionate. They were violations of God's divine order. What ultimately set Billy Graham apart from Fifield and Peale was the scale. Graham didn't just preach to a couple hundred people in a church. He preached from stadiums, from radio, from television. By the early 1950s, Graham had become the first truly modern evangelical celebrity, and millions of Americans encountered Christianity through his emotionally charged, mass-mediated preaching, where faith, individualism, and material success were increasingly framed as moral virtues. Once faith had been fully aligned with individual success, the next step followed almost naturally. If success and wealth signals virtue and failure signals moral weakness, then wealth itself starts to look like evidence of God's favour. And this is the soil the prosperity gospel grows out of. For those of you who don't really know what the prosperity gospel is, it's basically the belief that God wants you to be wealthy, healthy, and successful, and that faith is the mechanism that makes that happen. In practice, this means believers are told to sow a seed by giving money to a church or preacher with the explicit promise that God will repay them with financial success, healing diseases, or any kind of protection from hardship.
God took care of them and He'll take care of you. So today, I'm asking you to step out in faith and sow a seed.
The donations aren't framed as charity. They're framed as an investment. If you're sick, struggling, or desperate, giving more money is presented as the way to unlock your blessing. And at the top of the system are preachers who are worth tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. Many of them own multiple mansions, luxury cars, and private jets, which they justify by claiming God told them to have them. Their wealth isn't treated as a contradiction of Christian teaching. It's treated as proof that the message of just believing hard enough and sowing a seed works. Well, and if you sowed your seed by wiring some sketchy church $1,000 and didn't get your blessing, it just means you're not faithful enough. The point is, Christianity had been reshaped to say, God wants you to succeed, and faith produces material reward. So wealth inequality now started to look God-given, and systemic explanations for poverty are treated as distractions. By the late 20th century, this theology was ready to merge with something else: Christian nationalism. Because if free markets are God-ordained and the USA is the defender of free markets, then the US itself starts to look divinely chosen. But that ideology didn't just expand within the US. In the UK, it merged with British conservatism, empire nostalgia, and anti-immigration movements. So when people talk about the fusion of Christianity, capitalism, and nationalism as if it were some sort of organic cultural shift, that's not really what happened. These movements were engineered. Business elites defended capitalism by reshaping theology and redirecting sermons. They funded ministers, magazines, radio shows, and revival movements that taught millions of people to see capitalism as moral, inequality as natural, and government regulation, social welfare, and taxes as a threat to God's order. And once an economic system is framed as God's will, questioning it doesn't just make you wrong, it makes you immoral. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe and all of that, and let me know in the comments what you think about the evolution of Christianity. See you soon. Bye.